Hello friends, my name is JJ, and here is a drawing that I made of Richard Milhous Nixon, 1913 to 1994. He is one of the most important politicians in 20th century American history, and indeed world history. Because of this, he was also one of the most widely depicted men in history, with his face appearing not just in countless photographs and newsreels and TV broadcasts and movies, but also a vast assortment of paintings, sculptures, posters, cartoons, toys, and souvenirs. Many of these were deeply expressive works, communicating the vast range of feelings that Nixon, a deeply controversial and polarizing figure, evoked during his long era in the public spotlight. The era, as one author memorably put it, of Nixonland. So today, I thought it might be fun to look at some of these wide and varied depictions of America's 37th president, to look at 26 portraits of Richard Nixon. Nixon's physical appearance was heavily mocked for most of his adult life, but as a young man, he was considered relatively handsome, with striking dark features and an intense, powerful stare. He was just 32 when he was first elected to Congress and quickly earned a reputation as a combative and aggressive Republican. The dark intensity of his young face was soon interpreted as signifying something more sinister. This is an illustration that appeared in the February 1st, 1953 issue of Vogue magazine, depicting the 1953 inauguration of President Dwight Eisenhower. Vogue magazine was apparently more into politics in those days. Eisenhower had appointed Nixon to be his vice president, and check out how ominous he looks. This drawing was done by Al Hirschfeld, one of the most celebrated caricaturists in American history, reflecting on the way that he drew Nixon here with such dark, angry eyes. Hirschfeld would later write, "That look of ominous foreboding on Nixon's face wasn't so much prescience on my part as a case of character being destiny." While serving in Congress during the 40s and 50s, Nixon was a close ally of Senator Joe McCarthy and the McCarthyites, the notoriously paranoid faction of the American right, who claimed that the US government was riddled with undercover communist double agents. Nixon had a habit of claiming that anyone to the left of himself was soft on communism, or possibly even a closet communist themselves, and this was a style of rhetoric that he continued as vice president. The editorial cartoonist Herb Bloch, or Herb Bloch, who worked for the Washington Post for many years, was one of many prominent liberals in the American media who really grew to despise Nixon during this era. Herb Bloch did a lot of anti-Nixon cartoons, but this one from 1954 is probably his most famous. The context was that Vice President Nixon had been campaigning across the country for Republican candidates in the 1954 midterms, engaging in all of his usual red Beatty style language. And so you can see we have the vice presidential welcoming committee, and they're going, "Here he comes now." And then we've got Nixon crawling out of the sewer. The original copy of this cartoon is currently possessed by the Library of Congress, and on their website they have this little note. When later asked if he regretted drawing some cartoons, Herb Bloch replied that he might have done some differently, but not the manhole cartoon. Herb Bloch was one of many American cartoonists who would depict Nixon as a progressively uglier and uglier man as his political career progressed. His eyebrows grew heavier, his wattles fleshier, as the New York Times put it. As Hirschfeld had said, it all reflected the idea that Nixon's inner character was reflected by his external appearance. And given that this very much became the mainstream way to think about Nixon's looks, it can be kind of jarring to see some of the more flattering Nixon depictions that were made in his earlier years. In 1966, this marble bust of Nixon was added to the collection of the United States Senate, which includes a bust of every former vice president, since vice presidents also serve as the ceremonial president of the Senate in the American system. Nixon's was sculpted by the famed Italian artist Gualberto Rocchi, with his initial clay draft sculpted from life the year before. In 1968, Nixon was elected president, and Look magazine commissioned this painting of him for their February 4th, 1969 issue, which Nixon also modeled for. The painting was done by Norman Rockwell, who was, of course, one of the most iconic American illustrators of the mid-20th century, best known for doing magazine covers and advertisements featuring idyllic or even somewhat maudlin depictions of bourgeois American life. But he also did more conventional editorial work from time to time as well, including portraits of newsmakers. Rockwell was another very earnest, mid-century American liberal who didn't care much for Nixon's politics. He also went on the record a few times implying that he found Nixon too ugly to paint. But Rockwell was also an optimist who had this whole philosophy of painting things as they could or should be, more than they actually were. So he intentionally flattered Nixon, depicting him as the sort of wise, paternal-looking figure he thought that a good president should be. And the flattery seems to have worked. Nixon bought the painting from Rockwell, and in 1972, he donated it to the Hall of Presidents at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., where you can still see it to this day. Because it was designed to be an illustration for a magazine, it is by far the smallest of all of their presidential portraits, only 14 by 22 inches. But if that is too small for you, you can also see a super blown up version of it in the lobby of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. More recently, the Rockwell picture appeared on the cover of a very fawning book about Nixon, written by Ben Stein, the professor slash actor slash game show host slash Republican political pundit who worked briefly as a Nixon speechwriter when he was a young man. This is a plate that I bought on eBay many, many years ago. It is a knick-knack commemorating President Nixon's 1969 inauguration. You can see we have President and Mrs. Richard M. Nixon. I've always found this to be a really interesting cultural object because I think it embodies a kind of last gasp of a certain sort of mid-century American innocence. Historically, Americans were taught to revere the President of the United States as the man who occupied the same office as Washington and Lincoln and served as the highest guardian of the US Constitution. Beginning in the 19th century, it was common for middle-class American families to own various little commemorative keepsakes of the president and his family, a tradition almost certainly inspired by the way that the British revered their monarchy. By the 1960s, however, growing populism and irreverence in American culture undermined a lot of these sorts of square traditions. And of course, John F. Kennedy's murder injected a sort of Gothic bleakness into the presidency that made it a lot less fun to sentimentalize. But it was Nixon, whose term in the White House was consumed by division and scandal and concluded with a humiliating resignation, who most people would probably say truly represented the point of no return for the American presidency. From Nixon onward, presidents became just another politician, and owning things like this became tacky and weird, if not a little disturbing.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Nixon became president when he was 56 years old and now looked very much like a middle-aged man, as you can see from his official government photograph taken on February 11th, 1969, shortly after he was sworn in. Throughout the 1970s, this picture was a common sight, framed and hung in government buildings all across the United States and even abroad, as we see in this photo showing a portrait of President Nixon at a US Army base in South Vietnam. The increasingly aged nature of Nixon's face provided great fodder to cartoonists during his presidency, with his image in the popular imagination eventually being defined by a couple of his most distinctive facial features that could be exaggerated and played with to represent him in increasingly stylized and abstracted ways. This is a sketch of Nixon made by the famed American political cartoonist Bill Maudlin while giving a lecture at Yale University sometime in the 1970s. I got it from this excellent book on the history of editorial and political cartooning, published in 1976. Maudlin was showing the students how a skilled cartoonist can draw a famous person person with just a few strokes, which in Nixon's case consisted of his heavy eyebrows, dark eyes, and long sloping nose. This is another great minimalistic caricature of him from the cover of the September 28th, 1972 issue of Rolling Stone magazine, which was certainly pretty far up there as far as aggressively anti-Nixon publications went. The drawing was made by the British cartoonist Ralph Steadman, who also illustrated the accompanying article inside, which was written by Hunter S. Thompson. Thompson and Steadman were a great iconic duo of 70s era counterculture, and they were both deeply fascinated and repulsed by Nixon in a way that produced a lot of memorable art and writing. We talked about Nixon's eyes, but his long nose became a huge part of his public image as well, in part because of the great symbolic utility of the nose in American culture. Here we see a caricature of Nixon on the cover of the August 1972 issue of National Lampoon, which was a hugely influential American comedy magazine of the time. The drawing was done by Robert Grossman, who was a very prolific cartoonist and illustrator during the late 20th century. But this Nixon cartoon was probably the most famous thing he ever did. It was literally mentioned in the first line of his New York Times obituary. The gimmick of this cover was that it was a fold-out, with President Nixon's nose continuing onto the second page, where we find Henry Kissinger, who was one of Nixon's closest advisors, dressed as Jiminy Cricket. This is obviously an allusion to Pinocchio, which were very common during the Nixon years. Ever since Pinocchio came on the scene, having a long nose became synonymous with lying in American culture. And since Nixon was a cynical politician with a naturally long nose, cartoonists used and reused this idea to the point of cliche. No one did it quite as well as Grossman, though. Even less flatteringly, Nixon's long nose was often drawn in a very phallic way to make dick jokes, which was actually a more complex gag than you might think, given that Nixon had long gone by Dick as a short form of Richard, and Dick is of course American slang for a mean or awful person. This is an anti-Nixon poster from the 1970s that has some fun with this idea. I wasn't able to find much information on who was behind it, but it gives you an idea of the sort of thing that was going around at the time. Somewhat relatedly, Nixon was also known for his heavy, sagging jowls, which were often depicted as being somewhat scrotum-like. Hey, I'm sorry if this comes off as vulgar, but a lot of people hated Nixon. The British cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, who drew political cartoons for the Sunday Times for many decades, was obsessed with drawing Nixon as grotesquely as he could, and was particularly fond of making his jowls look more and more saggy and bloated with each subsequent cartoon. As he would write in one of his memoirs, "The more I drew Nixon, the more his face collapsed and his jowls continued to sag until they spilled onto the floor." In 1971, Scarfe made a bunch of sculptures of various political figures for a show at London's National Portrait Gallery. He was particularly proud of his Nixon sculpture, which was made of wood and had the jowls suspended from a brass hook as a sort of dangling pendulum type thing. Nixon's jowls were also notorious for being unshaven. This was something that went all the way back to 1960, during his unsuccessful run for president against John F. Kennedy. There was a very famous televised debate between these two men, and Nixon was said to have looked really terrible in it because he was either too proud or too ignorant to realize how bad he would look on camera if he didn't shave beforehand. When you look back at the footage now, I don't really think it's that obvious, but this idea that Nixon was some perennially unshaven man became a meme anyway, and like many aspects of his physicality, was interpreted as reflecting something dark about his inner character. He had a moral 5 o'clock shadow, was how old man Herblock once put it. I like this cartoon that was published by my local paper, the Vancouver Sun, by the great Canadian cartoonist Roy Peterson, sometime in the 1970s. It is supposed to be a take on the famous story of the portrait of Dorian Gray. So you see, we have President Nixon looking all clean-shaven and respectable, but then up in his attic, he has a re-election poster of himself that's all hairy and demonic, the true Nixon. The campaign poster in this cartoon is based on this famous one that Nixon used during the 1968 campaign, "Nixon's the one." It became a bit infamous just because as Nixon increasingly became seen as this negative, glowering figure, an image of Nixon with a big grin on his face became a symbol of a certain phoniness. Andy Warhol would later raise funds for Nixon's 1972 re-election opponent by making one of his famous silkscreen prints of this portrait, emblazoned with the slogan, "Vote McGovern." It later sold for over 40 grand, which I'm sure the Democrats appreciated. Other cartoonists focused on other parts of Nixon's physicality. Another famous editorial cartoonist up here in Canada is a guy called Asselin, and he focused on Nixon's ears. This is a cartoon he drew for the Montreal Star in 1970 with the US Army trying to pin the tail on the Vietnam donkey. I also like this one from 1973, where Nixon's been given a copy of the Sinatra album Come Fly With Me from Spiro Agnew, who was his disgraced vice president who had recently resigned. When I was 16, I emailed Asselin to ask him about this, and he replied, "If you check photos, Nixon did have rather large ears, combined with a low forehead, which, along with his darting eyes, gave him a devilish look. I would sometimes add points to the ears for emphasis." You can see some points in this one, where Asselin has drawn Nixon as the devil, stealing the soul of sweet, stupid Canada. The other thing that everybody really fixated on was Nixon's very distinctive receding hairline, which had this little wavy patch in the middle and large, bare temples. In the October 23, 1969 issue of the New York Review of Books, Murray Kempton wrote an essay observing how little anything in Washington had changed during the first year of Nixon's supposedly ambitious presidency, including America's deep involvement in the war in Vietnam. And the article was accompanied by this caricature of Nixon by the paper's cartoonist, David Levine, which, if you look closely, features the silhouette of former President Lyndon Johnson in the temples, the man who Nixon had promised to be completely different from. 4 years later, in February of 1974, Nixon's presidency was becoming increasingly consumed by the Watergate scandal, in which it was gradually revealed that Nixon had been involved in an elaborate criminal conspiracy to use the power of the government to persecute his political enemies and improve his chances in the '72 election. In response, New York Magazine ran this striking cover asking, "Is Nixon finally going under?" How many other presidents could be caricatured by forehead alone? The other dramatic thing that came out during the Watergate saga was that Nixon had secretly tape recorded many of the conversations he'd had in the Oval Office over the years, a revelation that would prove not just to be deeply self-incriminating, but a disturbing glimpse into the depths of his paranoia. Following these revelations, tapes and tape recorders became a huge symbol of all things Nixon, as we can see in this cartoon by the famous political cartoonist Renan Lurie. "Good morning, Mr. President." Nixon was hated for reasons beyond just Watergate, of course. His inability to bring the Vietnam War to a swift end, like he had promised, in favor of expanding it by bombing neighboring countries, made him a symbol of a certain sort of American imperialism, as embodied by this poster advertising an anti-war rally held on April 22nd, 1972 in San Francisco. But on the other hand, the fact that Nixon was such an aggressive anti-communist did earn him some artistic praise as well. This is almost certainly one of the strangest pieces of Nixon art ever created. It is a gigantic 6 by 10 foot painting made by Ferenc Dadai in 1970. Ferenc was a refugee to America from Hungary who had fled in 1956 during a tumultuous public uprising against that country's communist government. It was an event which provoked a lot of Hungarians to flee to America. This painting, which friends dedicated to Nixon on behalf of all grateful Hungarians, depicts Nixon as vice president, personally welcoming Hungarian refugees into freedom. The irony, of course, is that it is done in this garish Soviet realist style, making it seem distractingly propagandistic rather than sincerely affectionate. It's supposed to be based on an actual visit that Nixon made to the border of Hungary and Austria in 1956, where he met with some refugees and told them that America would gladly take them. But something tells me it didn't go exactly like this.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Nixon resigned from the presidency on August 9th, 1974, enormously disgraced and unpopular. A lot of the caricatures produced near the end of his presidency were truly repulsive, like this one, which appeared in an issue of National Lampoon around the time of his resignation. It was made by the British cartoonist and sculptor Roger Law, who would go on to make the popular 80s-era political puppet show Spitting Image. In his 1992 memoir, Law has an interesting line about Nixon, where he describes him as someone it was politically correct to dislike purely on the grounds of his face. In addition to his unpopularity, Nixon was in quite bad physical health when he resigned. He had been coughing up blood due to a lung infection and had been suffering from serious inflammation and clotting in the veins of his left leg. But given the political situation, a lot of Americans were not particularly sympathetic to his suffering, including the great abstract impressionist artist Philip Guston. In 1975, shortly after Nixon resigned, Guston did this painting of Nixon with his big, gross infected leg, wandering the beach in exile back in his native California. I think it is fair to describe this as a pretty mean-spirited painting, but it is also my personal favorite piece of art inspired by Richard Nixon. It is complicated and expressive and creative. It manifests a kind of contemptuous fascination that I find really compelling. Now, Nixon had very few friends by the time that he stepped down. The left utterly despised him, while many Republicans felt betrayed and disillusioned. And as a result, he received little of the respect and dignity that former US presidents traditionally got, with several post-presidency rituals revised or scaled back for him. In 1981, the White House Historical Association commissioned this rather generic-looking painting to be Nixon's official White House portrait, and it was quietly hung in an inconspicuous spot without any sort of public ceremony. Nixon resented this, and in 1984, he paid out of pocket to commission a nicer portrait by James Anthony Wills, who had done the portrait of President Eisenhower, and the first portrait was replaced, but again, without any sort of official fanfare. On July 19th, 1990, the official Richard Milhous Nixon Presidential Library opened. It cost $25 million and represented a conscious effort to help repair Nixon's damaged reputation and portray him as a basically normal president that Americans didn't have to feel guilty about liking. This is apparently the best-selling souvenir at the library gift shop, a mug depicting Nixon shaking hands with Elvis, based on what is probably the single most famous and widely reproduced photograph of Nixon ever taken, and probably even one of the most famous photos in all of American history. The story behind it is actually not that interesting, though. Elvis had basically conservative political views and wanted to meet Nixon, who he liked, so he did. The thing that most people tend to fixate on was the fact that Elvis was really supportive of Nixon's war on drugs, despite Elvis being a well-known drug user himself. This cartoon by Edward Swerrell was published in the October 1984 issue of GQ and portrays Elvis as constantly fidgeting and scratching himself like a druggie during the summit, which apparently he did.
Good evening, I'm Sarah James in New York. NBC News has learned that former President Richard Milhous Nixon has died tonight.
Richard Nixon died of a massive stroke on April 22nd, 1994, at the age of 81, nearly 20 years since his resignation. He was pretty firmly in his redemption arc by that point, but his death slowed that down a bit just because it invited so much fresh reflection on his legacy. It is tradition in the US to issue a special commemorative postal stamp the year after a president dies, but Nixon's reputation made this a deeply unpopular idea with the public. The post office went ahead anyway, releasing this very conservative design in April of 1995, featuring a portrait by Daniel Schwartz, but it failed to win over the public and sold very poorly. Some people still made a fortune on them though, at least briefly. A guy from New York bought several sheets of Nixon stamps, only to discover they were badly misprinted. Since it is extremely rare for misprinted stamps to make it to stores, they are highly valued as collectibles. So the guy sold them to collectors, who sold them to even richer collectors, and in February of 1996, headlines were made when a single Nixon invert stamp sold at auction for over $16,000. But then it turned out that the New York guy was a big liar and that he was just an employee of the stamp factory who had stolen the misprinted stamps from work, hoping to make a quick buck. He went to prison for theft of government property, and the Nixon misprint stamps are now illegal to own. In the years since his death, Nixon's role in American culture has transitioned from that of a deeply controversial contemporary politician to an increasingly distant and even somewhat whimsical historical figure. In 1999, Columbia Pictures released a comedy film about Nixon in which Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams played these giddy teenagers who befriend the president and stumble and bumble their way into uncovering the Watergate conspiracy. The film was called Dick, and you can see that the letter I in the logo was a silhouette of Nixon in his most iconic pose, which was doing a V sign with each hand and waving them above his head. We now think of this as being the peace sign, and in the movie, it is something from the hippie subculture that the girls teach Nixon to do. In reality, however, when Nixon did it, he was intending the gesture to be understood in the more old-fashioned way, which was to mean V for victory. This was a World War II era thing that had been popular with Nixon's mentor, President Eisenhower, among others. Here is a plastic toy of Nixon as he appeared in the Matt Groening cartoon Futurama. In Futurama's second season, which aired in 1999, Nixon comes back from the dead to get elected President of Earth in a portrayal that leans heavily on the idea of Nixon as an archaic symbol of 20th century political authority. He is a sort of sinister figure, but also just very buffoonish and ill-tempered. In subsequent episodes, it often feels like he's more just a caricature of uptight men from his generation than anything else. Which I feel is basically the role that Nixon occupies in the popular imagination today. 30 years since his death and nearly 60 years since he was first elected president. He's a late 20th century politician who's known for being sort of bad and sort of corrupt, but is also fast fading as a person Americans have any particularly deep or intense feelings about. A man closer to someone like Warren Harding than Donald Trump. Speaking of which, you might know that Donald Trump's infamous advisor, Roger Stone, has a tattoo of Nixon on his back. I believe it is supposed to be the portrait from the Nixon's the One poster. Roger Stone worked briefly for Nixon as a young man, but only got the tattoo in his 50s. And as Jeff Toobin would write for The New Yorker, this reflected the degree that some older right-wing men like Stone had come to revere Nixon for embodying a certain style of politics that had fallen out of fashion since the 1970s. A curious admixture of anti-communism, social moderation, and tactical thuggery. In other words, even to his contemporary fans, Nixon is loved mostly as an anachronism. So there you have it, Nixon summed up by a bunch of pretty disparate illustrations. So I have to say, this project really did serve as a strong reminder to me of just the degree and depth that Nixon was disliked in his own time, and just how much of a force of division he was in American life and culture. Like most presidents, he did some good things, but there was a central dishonesty to his character that is really quite difficult to overlook or forgive. I will say, though, that it is quite impressive how much artistic creativity hatred for Nixon produced. I don't really feel like people channel their political anger into creativity much these days. We mostly just complain. Anyway, if you know a great work of art inspired by Richard Nixon, let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.